president. I want to make a couple announcements just to let you guys know we are having a celebration next month. It's going to be on March 16th. We're going to have a networking component, a happy hour, and we're going to have a legal update. We're going to have a couple of our board members speaking about the changes that are happening right now and into 2023. So we would love you guys to join us. It's going to be March 16th. It's going to start at 3:30 just to have you check in between 3:30 and 4. We're going to have our speakers talking about those legal updates from 4 to 5, and then 5 to 6 we're going to have some appetizers, some wine, and that we can all socialize and celebrate being together. So just want to let you know about that. You'll see it in our newsletter coming out, and we'll be sending you an invite as well. And if you just joined, if you can mute yourself, I'd greatly appreciate it. And I am going to introduce our speakers today. We actually have Christine Hendrickson and Zach Wedman, and they are going to be working together to talk about compensation and what's going on. Let me just spotlight you, Christine, and we can get this party started.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having us today. We wanted to talk about something that is becoming kind of table stakes around for HR leaders, which is this shift to greater pay transparency. My name is Christine Hendrickson, and I am the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at Syndio, which is a workplace equity technology platform. And in my prior life, I was a partner and the co-chair of the Global Pay Equity Group at Seyfarth Shaw, and sat within the Chicago office of Seyfarth Shaw. So some of the names on here are familiar from those prior days. So it's really nice to see folks. It's nice to see folks, and it's nice to meet new friends today. But we wanted to talk, Zach and I, and I'm going to turn this over to Zach in just a second. But Zach and I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of like what we're seeing in this space. And so Zach has been having a lot of these conversations. So I'm going to turn this over to Zach for just a minute to introduce himself, and then we can talk a bit more about what we wanted to cover. So Zach.
Perfect. Thank you, Christine. Hi, everyone. I'm Zach Weedman. So I'm a senior account executive here at Syndio. I partner with Christine and primarily work with organizations in the Midwest, mostly in Illinois, around their workplace equity journey and the evaluation of Syndio and if we could be a proper partner for them. So I'll give you a little bit of context on what we do, how we support our customers, and how that kind of intertwines to what Christine and I plan on talking about today. And when I talk about workplace equity, it really means two things, at least to us here at Syndio, and that's equal pay for equal work, and then also equal access to opportunities. So really kind of a wraparound look at equity internally for your employees, and fairness at the core. That's just at a high level of what we look to accomplish with our customers, and how we do that is through technology and wraparound support and consulting. So really kind of the three big themes of what we do with our customers are a more real-time and agile approach to pay equity. We do, built off of that, more insights around equitable starting pay. So making sure that we're using our internal equity to align with what's externally competitive, to make sure that at the time of hire, we're getting equity right. And then last but not least, really all around representation and opportunity equity. So understanding, how do you look today? How do we want to look in the future? And where do we want to spend and invest our precious DE&I resources to drive the most strategic and systematic change internally at your organization? So our platform provides that level of insights. And you saw some of the logos there on the screen. We work with about 275 organizations across the globe. So just a little bit of insight and kind of our background and where we're coming from when we talk about pay transparency and how that's going to impact employer brand, employee retention, and all of the different hot topics and questions I'm sure you're seeing today. So I'll pass it back over to you.
Yeah, no, I think I wanted to just lay that groundwork, because that's really that's the vantage point that we're coming to this conversation from, which is we're having a tremendous number of conversations about organizations that are just trying to understand what does that journey look like for them, and how do they get there. And what we're seeing when we look back at 2022 and then forward to 2023 is that we're seeing this crash of kind of two major trends. One of them is that we're seeing a global cross-pollination of pay transparency laws. And so primarily today, we're going to talk about what's going on in the US on these pay transparency laws that require that employers actually put the pay range on job postings. But we also wanted to give you kind of a preview of what we're seeing happening around the globe, not because we think that it's going to kind of have this immediate day-to-day impact on your organization, although some of you, of course, have global operations, and so it will have that kind of impact. But because when we look at what is happening in Europe, we're seeing the future of where it's likely heading in the US too. So we're going to talk mainly about the pay transparency laws in the US, and I hope that we can we're going to try to see if we can get have folks join that discussion, even if through chat, through the chat feature, as we're talking about the pay transparency laws in the US. But then we're also going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Europe with a preview of the EU directive, because what we're seeing happening is more and more laws requiring pay scale disclosure, more laws requiring pay reporting, more focus on median and mean pay gaps. And not surprisingly, those things have given to the rise of the $100 million pay equity settlement. So if we look back when all of the pay equity laws were strengthened back in 2015, 2016, a lot of the pay equity settlements were not quite nuisance value, but if you're a really large organization, a settlement of, $2, $3, $4, $5, even $10 million is certainly substantial, but it wasn't like the $100 million settlements that we were seeing with wage and hour laws. And so as employers were kind of balancing their limited resources, there was this kind of thought that we'll get to the pay equity piece of it, but we really want to make sure that our wage and hour is fully buttoned up. And of course, that's still very, very important. But we are now seeing in 2022, many lawsuits that settled above $100 million. So Google, Sterling Jewelers, Riot Games, and others all had settlements above that $100 million mark on pay equity. And there were a couple of roots of what prompted those lawsuits that we wanted to talk about as well. When we think of pay transparency, it certainly is everything that is happening with the law, because we went from last year, we started 2022 with only Colorado requiring that the pay ranges be posted at the bottom of your job postings. And we ended the year with 9 jurisdictions passing laws to require that. And we have it on the roadmap of many other jurisdictions, including right here in Illinois, with Chicago proposing a pay scale disclosure law that's currently pending. And that prompted all of the other things that we've seen. So employees are certainly sharing. If you wanted to do a hand raise of if you're seeing that within your organizations on Zoom or drop it in chat, if you're seeing that, we're seeing that much more often is that employees are sharing information, whether that's happening through consolidated sites like RepView, or if it's happening kind of more organically with people sharing on LinkedIn or TikTok. But a lot of it is just kind of the water cooler chat that happens of people just feeling like much more comfortable about having discussions about what their pay looks like. Indeed began in January automatically posting a range if an employer doesn't put the range in for their role. So if your jobs are swept up by Indeed, that gap is, and you're not including the pay range, then that information is kind of being filled in on the back end. And then some employers, Microsoft was kind of the first to go out in a very public way, saying that they're going to put ranges on all, or started putting ranges on all of their roles nationwide. We think that this is important because while only 1/3 of employees feel like their pay is fair, almost 2/3, and meaning that like almost 2/3 think that their pay is potentially inequitable. And those folks are at a higher risk of leaving your organization. It's often filled in with misinformation. It's often not, and we're seeing that too, like so many of the folks saying that they're seeing it more frequently. You're seeing it, Gail, thanks for your comment, Katie, that we're seeing that in the absence of having employers set the narrative for their organizations, employees are just filling in those gaps often with misinformation. So there's this kind of real advantage of understanding it. One of our colleagues who sits with me on the strategy team often says, who needs the law when you have TikTok? So that's something that we often talk about because it's just being shared so much. So what's the concern? Like, what do we fear when we see the ranges? And I was going to show a quick video. Some of you may have already seen this, but I've seen it many times and I still love it. So I was going to just share it just because it's one of my favorite approaches of like thinking about why pay transparency matters so much and why having an agenda around or rather leading your employees in terms of this is how we pay employees and this is why is so important. So I'm gonna play this right now.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs and with birds and with chimpanzees, but with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food than you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
So I think that is honestly the biggest fear that all of us have as we see all of these pay scale transparency laws kind of sweeping the country, which is that as this information, which was largely hidden from discussions with employees, maybe some of you were, very proactive and have already shared pay ranges with your leaders and with your managers, and maybe even with your employees. And if you did, and if you've already gone through this process, then you're in good spots. But for a lot of employers, this is the first time that those information is out there. And when people are seeing that they are paid cucumber wages and other people are paid grape wages, it means that we need to have, like, what we call it Syndio pay explainability. Like, you need to be able to explain to people, this is why you're paid what you're paid. This is why you're paid what you're paid. And this is how you move up in the organization to be paid more. And that we have to build this muscle with our managers and with our leaders to really be able to do that, because that's really what these pay transparency laws are requiring of employers. So I wanted to give, not to get too nerdy in the weeds on the law, although I'm happy to nerd out on any of that because I love it. But the way that these laws kind of happened was, originally there was a set of jurisdictions. And actually, California used to be on that side. Washington State used to be on that side. When the laws first came out, the thought was, we're going to make pay ranges available, but only upon request. So if you were applying for a job and you were applying for a job in Maryland or in Cincinnati or in Toledo, or back before the law changed in California or Washington State, you could request the pay rate. If you were applying for a job, you've gotten through a certain stage in the hiring process, you could request the pay range for the job that you were considering. But because of the fact that most job applicants are not HR experts like you all, a lot of people didn't even really know about these laws. And so the requests that we were seeing were largely few and far between. There were some exceptions, but it was largely few and far between. So in 2021, the jurisdictions like Connecticut and Nevada and Rhode Island amended their laws. And those amendments required that, instead of requiring kind of reactive disclosure only if a candidate happened to know about the law, they changed it to be much more proactive, so that you actually had to provide the information at some stage in the hiring process, with the idea that, at least individual candidates that were applying for roles would be armed with that information before they went into their salary negotiation discussions. And then we had Colorado, and Colorado stood alone. So Colorado came up with a law that at the time just seemed like wildly radical, and now feels incredibly mainstream, which is that Colorado requires that, required, it went into effect last year in January of 2022, that employers actually had to post the pay range for the job upon request. But because it was just Colorado kind of standing alone, a relatively small jurisdiction relative to a relatively smaller market relative to California or New York or Chicago, they didn't, it seemed like employers were kind of handling it as a one-off. Some employers even tried to, for a while, say that they weren't even going to hire in Colorado anymore to avoid having to post that information. But then what happened is that in 2023, there was a wave of laws that required this. And so we went from just Colorado on January 1st of 2022 to 9 jurisdictions requiring it by the end of 2022 in just those 12 months. So to that list, California passed a law, Washington State, New York City, and then several other kind of smaller jurisdictions in the New York metro area and New York State passed these laws. And once we saw this kind of New York State and California and Washington and Colorado, that it was becoming increasingly difficult for employers that had operations all across the country to comply in a jurisdiction by jurisdiction way. And we saw that many employers were taking a totally different approach to looking at that, moving from a kind of reactive approach to something that was more proactively kind of owning that narrative. What we see for 2023 is I talked with a reporter at Bloomberg, and I said that it looks like pay equity on steroids, because it really does. So this year we have laws proposed in Chicago, in Hawaii, in Vermont, even in South Dakota. Although that one's kind of been tabled, the many South Carolina, Massachusetts, kind of across the country, we're seeing more and more of these laws. And so I would expect that as we move through, we're just kind of kicking off the legislative process for the year in most jurisdictions. But I would expect as we move towards middle of the year to later in this year, we're going to see that this list of 9 becomes a list of perhaps 18, as we see more jurisdictions kind of picking up this idea. So what do these laws require, kind of at a very high level? Generally, what they require is that you have to disclose the minimum and maximum salary range, so just base pay, for new hires, transferred, or promotions. There are 2 laws, both Colorado and Washington State, that in addition to putting the base pay range, also require that you provide a general description of the other components of compensation that you provide. So for example, it would say the range for this job is 60 to 80,000, and you're also eligible for bonus, or you're also eligible for commission, and we offer these benefits, pay time off, health insurance, dental insurance, whatever, 401k matching, whatever the benefits are. So you have to put an actual dollar figure tied to the base pay range, but then you have to provide just a general description in just those 2 jurisdictions. None of the jurisdictions right now require that you disclose a range tied to anything other than base pay. Although, as I mentioned, the kind of pay transparency on steroids, many of the laws that have been proposed this year also extend to other components of compensation, like bonus and commission and the like. These laws generally cover all job advertisements. So if you're posting a job in one of those jurisdictions that is covered by one of those laws, then it needs to include that pay range. Some of the laws, like we see in California and elsewhere, also require disclosure to current employees as well. So we have a cheat sheet that, Zach, maybe you've already done. Yes. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Amazing. Thank you. So there's a cheat sheet that kind of tracks all of the details of the laws. And then also there's that Bloomberg article that I mentioned, that we were talking about some of the laws that are coming, so that you can see also what's coming down the line. They require most of this kind of new wave requires proactive disclosure. And one thing that I wanted to mention is that remote employees are covered. So let's take this example. You have even one employee that sits in Colorado, or you have just 15 employees that sit in Washington State, or you have 4 employees that are in New York State or city. If you meet that employee threshold, which are pretty low in a lot of these places, then you have to also include the pay range for any job that is a remote job. So the first thing that you would want to do is, like, are we on the hook for these laws because we meet that minimum threshold? If so, all of your remote jobs would have to include the pay range. And because the pay range applies in most of these jurisdictions to remote jobs too, if you have things like, you have a single employee that sits in Colorado, they're on your sales team, or they just moved to Colorado because it's beautiful. Zach lives in Colorado, so that was a nod to Zach. If you have even a single employee in Colorado, you would have to include the range for any job that could be done remotely, with the idea being that it's possible that someone from Colorado would apply, or it's possible that someone from one of those other jurisdictions. And so, like, kind of just a special watch out for those remote roles, because it is covered pretty well. So I wanted to kind of see if we could figure out from all of us 2 polling questions. And I was thinking that you could either come on and either come on with your camera on or off. And if you want to discuss kind of where you're going, but it would be fabulous if folks could vote in the chat. So if this is something that is on your radar, what are you kind of most worried about? And it could be either because you're currently dealing with it, or because your organization is anticipating that this is coming for you. So what would be your biggest fears? Would it be that you don't know exactly what the range would be? Is it that you don't know exactly how you would put it on the job description, the mechanics of that? Are you more worried about employees seeing the ranges, or how you're going to communicate about it, or if there's something else that is giving you pause? If you wanted to just like drop a number into the chat that aligns to what you're worried about. Lots of 3s and 4s. So that's exactly what we often hear. 3s and 4s. Elizabeth, I don't know if you would be comfortable mentioning what your 5 is, like what, or if you wanted to put it in the chat, but we'd love to hear from you if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I think it'd just be easier if I spoke it.
Yeah.
So I work for an HR staffing firm, and one of the biggest concerns that we have about this whole thing is when we put like the salary ranges that our clients are giving us onto the website when we're posting our positions, that candidates are only going to come to us and want the highest salary range when they're not qualified for that salary, if that makes sense. Like, they don't have the amount of experience to justify the higher end of the salary range.
That's critical. That's a big thing that we've heard a lot, is that when people see the range, and let's say that the range is 60 to 80 or 60 to 85 or 60 to 100, applicants are like, oh, I should be at the top end of that range, not understanding that like you're usually hiring at a lower point in that range. And when the laws first came out, so like when Zach and I did this kind of series of roundtables across the country, and we talked to a lot of employers, and when the New York City law came out, it seemed like employers were like, we're going to post the whole range because we just can't figure out what we should do. But then as the New York City law was nearing and actually went into effect in November, they posted these wide ranges. And there was just this huge backlash in the press around, these ranges are too wide, and they're 50% differentials, which for like on the comp folks are like, yeah, that seems kind of normal for a range. That is what a range looks like. And they got so much pushback, so that when the California law was coming around, and the Washington state law, people were like, well, maybe we'll post a narrower range. And so we'll just say this is the hiring range. So we typically hire at the midpoint for this role. But then Washington state came out with guidance and said, basically, if you post the narrower hiring range, you also have to post the broader range for the entire job. And then we had also heard that employers that had posted the narrower range were getting pushback because they were hearing that well, employees were like, these aren't the real ranges because I know people that are higher than whatever the posted range is. So I think that, as both Zach and I think that one of the things comes back to kind of pay explainability concept of like being able to, and Elizabeth, and it's a difficult position for you because these are not even your ranges, right? You're trying to describe them for a lot of other employers, but we've worked a lot with employers to put together kind of a communication strategy around what does that look like? How should we communicate? What do we need to explain so that our managers and our recruiters are armed with the information that they need? Another person who mentioned number 5 is Tara. Tara, would you consider telling us a little bit about your pain points?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with the last person. I think it may have been Elizabeth, but for us, so I've worked with a nonprofit, and so a piece of it, it's not the whole part, but a piece of it is our donors actually seeing the pay ranges and understanding more specifically about what we're paying, and then just having questions around that. I mean, typically we pay pretty low comparatively, but yeah, just some concerns around that.
Oh, that's so interesting. How about anyone else? Would anyone else be open to sharing kind of either your pain points or some successes that you've had of like trying to balance these ranges? Okay, well, I won't put anyone on the spot, but I did have one other question that I was hoping that we could talk through together, which is, how are you currently approaching disclosing pay ranges? So are you doing it just where it's required by the law? Are you considering a nationwide approach or even a global approach? Or are you taking a different approach that may be different? So if you want to do the same thing and just drop into the chat kind of where you're landing, that would be fantastic. Yeah. It sounds like that's a lot of, some 1s, couple 2s in there as people are looking nationwide. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, totally a mix, it looks like. Oh, that's interesting, Tara. So Tara said that they share it with applicants if their requirements on their application are different than your range. So Tara, are your employees just in Illinois?
No, they're predominantly in Charleston, and then we do have a variety of our positions that are listed as remote. We don't currently share the range in that, but now that I'm hearing all that you say, we may have to move to that.
Well, only if you have employees that are like you. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. That makes perfect sense. That makes great sense. Okay. Anything else that anyone wanted to add to that discussion, kind of what their strategy was on that?
Christine, I was just going to mention, have you seen this where they'll have a big range, but then they'll break it down into almost 3 quadrants to explain to the applicant, like, hey, if you're in the beginning of your career and you only got 1 to 3 years, this is where you're going to fall, and you're probably going to be more in this section. Midpoint is really people that have been in it for like 5 to 7. And then our subject matter experts are our seniors, and that's where they're going to be at that end tail of that range.
Yes. Having that narrative, like owning that narrative and being able to have, either because you're posting it on your job postings or because you've built the muscle with your recruiting team and your hiring managers to be able to feel like very comfortable with those discussions. A lot of the things that we do at Syndio are, we conduct pay equity analyses, right, with a lot of employers. And one of the things that we help employers do is figure out, like, well, what do we pay for? How do we define where we are in the range? And so a lot of the things that we were doing when these laws first came out and still is getting our arms around, like, what are the factors? Like, how do we build what it is that we pay for? Like, how do we know that we're paying for those things? Because I think that, it's that ability. But Katie, that's like brilliant. I think that's exactly the point that you want to get to. Yeah.
I would share one quick thing.
Yeah, please.
Because Katie, you're spot on. It's about explaining, having perfectly valid reasons of why your employees are paid what they're paid and why that is equitable to others in similar situations, right? Where we see organizations struggle with this is I saw a lot of 1s and 3s as far as defining the range and people seeing it, is we can get into a little bit of a hamster wheel where it becomes, if an employee asks, well, why am I paid $100,000? Well, that's because you're in level 10 or whatever the case may be. And go, okay, great. Well, why am I in level 10? And they say, it's because you get paid $100,000. Like that's where we see kind of folks tripping on themselves, is their explanation to why you're paid what you're paid isn't sufficient, right, to folks that are asking, or to applicants, and they're looking for that level. There's a lot of research. Josh Burson did quite a bit on pay equity as well, and people are perfectly comfortable being paid differently from their peers as long as they understand why and they feel that it's a valid reason for it. And I think that your kind of point of describing the different quadrants is a great example of explaining to candidates or employees why you're paid what you're paid.
And I love that, Zach, because I think it goes back to arming your managers to have those difficult conversations with feedback.
Yeah.
So people understand that why, like you just said. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, that would be a good, we can add that to that room, is that Josh Pearson research. It's interesting. And I like echo what you both just said, is that, everyone's an expert in their own pay. And so people have a good reason. So you have to be able to kind of counter that narrative in a way that they can see themselves in that data. So if you say, well, our early career folks are at the bottom of that range, but actually because of pay compression, you have lagging folks that are very experienced that are at that bottom of that range. It's figuring out, like, where are those folks and making sure that they're sitting where they should within that range too, because otherwise people it just, like, it falls apart. But it's a new muscle for all of us. These are not conversations that, we were all very used to having them in the background in HR, but they're not something that we were used to having, kind of one-on-one conversations with everyone who's now a comp expert. And you have employees asking questions about comp ratio. It's just wild. Okay, so that's where we are kind of in the US. We wanted to mention a little bit about where we are around the globe too. And we say this again, like, not because we want us all to be like subject matter experts on the EU directive, although I'm, again, happy to totally nerd out on it. But more because I think that that where the EU is going on pay equity is going to be the new global high watermark. And it's going to be the way that we're going to all be kind of thinking about pay equity if we look out on the horizon a little bit further. So again, I think, like, what is on our immediate term is addressing these pay scale transparency laws. But what is on our longer term vision is really what's coming with the EU. So the EU has been working on this equal pay and transparency directive literally since 2017. And it's gone through iteration after iteration after iteration after iteration. In December, the European Parliament and the Council reached an agreement generally on the terms of what the text would be. And that has now gone through committee approval, and the final text of what is in the EU directive has now landed. There's one more kind of procedural vote, which is currently scheduled to be March 29th. So just next month. And then once agreed, then it has to get published in the official journal. And then that kicks off the process where each of the 27 member states have to transpose the elements into national law, and they have 3 years to do it. So this is not going to be something that happens tomorrow. It's actually going to be something that's happening kind of the spring of 2026. But as you'll see, it has almost imagine that everything that you've dealt with on pay equity in the US and everything that has happened globally on pay equity over the period of 10 years is going to hit all at once in 27 countries on the same date. That's what's coming in 3 years. That's why it's like, we have 3 years, but it's also like we only have 3 years for organizations that have operations in Europe, because we have to do things like, not only do we have to do, pay equally for equal jobs, so people that in the same job, and not only do we have pay scale transparency requirements, but we also have to compare people that are doing, so the EU will have the similar laws to what we see in the United States, which is the requirement to include the pay range in job postings or provide it before the time of interview. So that's going to be coming to Europe. Plus, we're going to be comparing jobs that are not the exact same, but are of equal value. Plus, we're going to have to provide information to individual employees about their pay and the pay of their peers upon request. Plus, there's public pay reporting, calculating median and mean pay gaps, and a joint pay assessment. There's a lot of meat that's coming here. And when I look at it, like what we currently have in the US, we have pay scale transparency. We've been talking about that in a lot of jurisdictions. A lot of jurisdictions already ban asking questions about prior salary. That appears in the EU directive. We already in the US largely allow employees to have conversations about pay, either because of the National Labor Relations Act or state law, or because you're a federal contractor. And we've seen this rise in the $100 million lawsuit. But what we don't yet have as much of is as much of a focus on the median pay gap, although we're seeing a little bit of it in California. We're not focusing quite as much on these representation metrics, although certainly it's showing up in your ESG reports, and it's becoming like very common that you're sharing that information. But public pay gap reporting, comparing people that are not doing the exact same job, these are all things that I expect are going to be coming in a big way to the US because of what's happening on the EU directive. So Zach, would you mind sharing the link to the EU directive cheat sheet? That might be kind of interesting. That has a lot more details. We have like a very detailed FAQ on there on what's required on that. So we just wanted to put this on your radar screen. Sorry, I went the wrong direction there. We just wanted to put this on your radar screens because it's certainly something that's coming very, very soon with the final vote, the culmination of something that's been going on since 2017, happening in March of 2023. So is this something, if we wanted to do, like is the EU directive new to you? Is this something that you've heard about before? If it's new to you, would you mind putting a 1 in the chat? If it's something that you've heard a lot about before, if you can put a 2. I think it's new to almost every, yeah, Jesse, Julie knows, Julie's on top of it, but yeah, it's something that for most employers is going to be really new. Even as we've been talking with reporters around it, they're like, I didn't even know that this was coming. And I'm like, it's coming in a really big way. And it's going to make everything that we've done so far like seem easy in comparison. So.
But I love that you're bringing it up now, because you're saying we got 3 years, so we can phase the approach to make those milestones to make it happen.
Exactly. So if I were sitting in your shoes, the things that I would just begin to start thinking about is, if you have employees in Europe, in any of the 27 member states, a lot of these requirements kick in even if you have a single employee in one of the member states. So for example, the pay scale disclosure or the right to information. Some of the public pay reporting, you have to have larger employee populations. So you have to have, it starts off at 150 or more employees in any country, but ultimately will go down to 100. But as you're thinking through, like, what are we going to do from a national standpoint on the pay scale transparency, just wanted to put it on your radar that you may also want to think of like, what are we going to do in Europe and then maybe even globally as we start thinking through those things.
Christine, I'd love your thoughts, and I'll pose you kind of a question for the group, and then we can open it up to see if there's others. Even if you don't have employees that would be impacted, through the EU directive.
Right, totally.
It's something that I'm thinking about, or I hear quite a bit from some of our larger customers or multinational customers, is that how quickly all of this is coming. You had mentioned something like the Colorado rule seemed radical, that was just introduced last year, right? And now it's to a certain extent table stakes. So what is your sense of how the proposed EU directive will influence what happens here in the United States? It's been a very copycat sort of thing. So do you see that influencing anything here stateside?
Oh, I love this question because yes, I totally do. I totally do because actually the EU commission, the EEOC commissioner, one of the EEOC commissioners, Sonderling, actually was in Europe meeting with a lot of the legislators that were responsible for the EU directive. So we're seeing that like really kind of on the ground cross-pollination. And actually just in 2 days, like on Friday, Syndio is doing a webinar with the senator who was the leader of the California pay transparency bill, Senator Limón. And Senator Limón was like Forbes magazine had like a future of work, and they nominated like 50 future of work leaders. And Senator Limón was like the only legislator at the state or federal level that was on that list. So she's like really thinking forward on this. And then on that same webinar, we have Senator Jessica Ramos, who was the senator who was behind the New York State pay scale transparency law. Because what we often see is that what happens in California and what happened, they kind of ping pong across each other until it moves into the rest of the country on the pay equity. And so Senator Limón and Senator Ramos we're doing a webinar with them on Friday. And that's actually one of my questions, Zach, is like someone on LinkedIn, I'd asked on LinkedIn, like if people had questions that they would want me to ask Senator Limón and Senator Ramos. And that was actually one of the questions, Zach, and we even have this conversation. So it wasn't even planned, but that was good. And so that was one of the questions that I was going to ask is like, are they keeping eyes on what's happening on the EU? And is that something that they're kind of thinking of for their states as they're considering new legislation in California and in New York? But I actually, if you guys have any questions that we'd love for you to join, you're welcome to join. It's free on Friday if you wanted to join. But if there are any questions that you would be curious about either the California or the New York law, definitely let us know either in the chat or afterward, or reach out to us afterwards, because we're still kind of finalizing our question list for that webinar. Yeah. How about others? Other things that are feeling like that you're doing within your organizations? Does anyone have like a win, like a quick win that they've had? Katie mentioned the idea of having, posting the portions of the range, but has anyone had any conversations with your hiring managers or your recruiters on how to start to have those conversations that have worked or have failed? Actually, failures are great too, because we can learn a lot from them. Some of the things, Zach, that we've heard are putting together like quick explainer videos around like, this is what the range is and this is what it means, and sharing those out with employees and applicants. We've also seen employers put together like a one-pager on like, this is what our compensation strategy is, or like our compensation philosophy is, and that the recruiters share that out to any candidate who they're either phone screening or interviewing, so that to just kind of like begin those conversations so that people don't automatically presume they're going to be at the top of that range when it gets there. It's hard for you on the staffing side because you're dealing with so many different employers. So I definitely feel for you, Elizabeth, like when you were talking about that, because that's really hard. That's really that adds a layer of challenge, but.
Christine, the difficulty that I've seen throughout the organizations that I've worked at is that some of the places have had long years of service. So when you're starting to bring new people in, they're making more than some of the people that have been in the organization for a while. Because when we look at compensation studies, you're better off jumping every few years to get to that higher pay. And I think that's some of the battles when we talk about employee engagement is how as an employer do you make it right for the loyalty of people staying?
Yeah. Totally. That's Danielle says that's their number one problem too. Compression. Yeah. We hear it a lot. You know, have you had any success? Can we share any companies? Let me see if any of them are public with it. I can say, I don't think that this would be sharing anything out at school. Microsoft did that. They created pay range info to share with applicants and with employees. And because they were like the first to go out with a nationwide approach. So they did that. We heard that there were several big kind of consulting companies. They did like Chalk Talks where they were doing like recorded presentations, like webinars. Like it doesn't have to be slick, like literally recording yourself on a webinar and sending it out. Yes, loyalty versus skills, years of service versus performance, huge problem. And that's the stuff that we've often looked at is that like you don't want to go out and say it's only experience if it's experience plus performance, plus geography, like whatever those things are. Yeah, Debbie, do you want to say anything more about that? That was a really great point.
That was just my concern that we have to be careful that how we communicate it, because I definitely look at performance when we're doing performance reviews. Some people may not get the full percentage, and then later when we're looking at, you know, having to share all this information with employees to be able to explain that maybe differently.
Totally. Yeah. On the Syndio platform, do you want to talk about policy analytics? So that's what I was going to say. Is that what you're going to say, Zach?
I was just going to say there's what we see for a lot of organizations is that new hire starting salaries and your internal pay equity work tend to be siloed or disconnected when really they should be married at the hip. One of the biggest issues of what draws organizations to need to remediate or fix issues year over year or whatever the case may be is because they are hiring people at higher rates to get them in the door. And then there's, to your point about loyalty, people that have been there for 10 years, now they're making substantially less than somebody that just walked in. So we encourage, and of course, this is what Syndio helps our customers with, but is to use your pay equity work in the process for making offers. So that way you can have a communication strategy, both internally to current employees as well as to external candidates, that when we go through these processes, we are keeping equity, you know, in mind as part of the process, is where we're seeing this conversation kind of start to go to the loyalty versus skills, service versus performance, et cetera.
Yeah.
And
You know what another one would be to drop would be that Anthem or Elevance Health. Anthem, which is now Elevance Health, they had like a whole thing on how they did that too. We can share that. We can share that as well.
All right, we got a couple minutes left. We got about 3 minutes. So if there's any last minute questions we want to ask Zach or Christine, now would be the time.
And I'll just wrap up and say a ton of resources and things that we of course shared to the chat, and Christine and I will put the deck and things together and make sure that that gets distributed to everyone. And if there are additional questions in the future that we can be helpful with, we're happy to.
Well, we can't thank you guys enough for joining us, sharing the articles, asking those questions, and really meeting everybody where they're at with compensation and where to go in the future. So thank you so much for sharing all your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
All right, everybody, have a great Wednesday and thank you for your time. We'll send you an email that has our YouTube channel so you can watch this event again, and then all the resources that Christine and Zach shared. And we hope to see you on March 16th for our happy hour and our legal update to celebrate our new chapter. Have a good one.
Thank you.